The frost hadn't melted yet when the wheelbarrows started squeaking along Miller's Gap Road, a little after 5:30 in the morning, and for a moment old Walt Pruitt, sitting in his idling truck, waiting on the school bus to clear the bend, thought it must be some stray dog dragging a bucket. It wasn't a dog. It was Sadie Marsh, 8 years old, wearing her late grandmother's canvas barn coat with the sleeves rolled back 3 times, pushing a wheelbarrow nearly as big as she was through the dark. She didn't wave at Walt's truck. She didn't slow down. She stopped at his fence line, where a compost heap had gone gray and slick with mold the autumn before, the one he'd walked past all winter and called a lost cause, and she knelt in the frozen mud like she was kneeling at a grave. Then she started digging, barehanded, breath fogging in front of her face. By the time she reached the Hargrove place, then the old Denny lot, then finally her own family's fields, the wheelbarrow was so heavy she had to lean her whole small body into it just to keep it moving. Her boots, her grandmother's boots, 3 sizes too big, stuffed with newspaper at the toe, were caked black to the ankle, and on her face was an expression that had nothing to do with childhood and everything to do with grief that had found somewhere to go. Her father, Walter Marsh, watched her come up the drive from the kitchen window, coffee mug halfway to his mouth. He didn't call out. He just watched his daughter push 6 months of the town's garbage past the barn where his own mother used to keep her compost bins, and for a second his throat went tight enough that he had to look away. Nobody in town understood what Sadie Marsh was doing that October morning. Not her father. Not her mother, Colleen, who'd cried more in the last 5 months than in the 15 years before them. Not the neighbors, who were already starting to laugh about that Marsh girl and her garbage cart. Sadie herself couldn't have explained it fully. All she knew was that her grandmother had left her something buried in the dirt, and she intended to find it. If a story about grief turning into growth is one you needed today, stay with us. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We read every one. Ivy Hollow sat where the Kentucky Hill country flattened out into creek-bottom farmland, the kind of place where everybody's mailbox had a name on it that had been there for 3 generations. In October, the fields went the color of driftwood. Wood smoke hung low over the valley in the mornings, and everyone knew everyone's business before noon. The Marsh farm had been worked by 5 generations of Marshes, 90-some acres of corn and soybeans that Walter tended the way his father had, and his father before him. Early mornings, few words, a body that ached in the same places his father's had. His wife Colleen ran the household accounts and the kitchen garden both, and for years she'd been the one to notice things first, the yield sliding, the bank calls getting longer, the way Walter had stopped whistling on his way out to the barn. And there was Ruth, Walter's mother, Sadie's grandmother, who had lived in the little house behind the main one for as long as Sadie could remember, and who had kept a compost pile behind that house for 30 years, turning it by hand, calling the finished stuff black gold, letting Sadie dig in it for worms on Sunday afternoons. Ruth had passed in April, quietly, in her sleep, the week after the redbuds bloomed. Sadie hadn't cried at the funeral. She'd cried 3 weeks later, alone, behind the barn, staring at her grandmother's compost bins going untended and forgotten. That same summer, the farm itself was dying a slower, quieter death. Walter's corn had come in 18 bushels under county average for the 3rd year running. His soybeans barely nodulated. He bought more fertilizer he couldn't afford, and the ground gave him less and less back for it. In August, the county extension agent, a soft-spoken woman named Dana Reyes, drove out and walked the rows with him. She knelt, took a handful of soil, pressed it between her fingers, and let it crumble. "Compaction here," she said. Then, a few steps later, quieter. "Walter, your organic matter's almost gone. Years of tillage, years of synthetic inputs. The biology in this soil has been starving. It can't hold water. It can't hold much of anything anymore. So what do I do?" "You can keep feeding the crop," she said, "or you can start feeding the soil. Those aren't the same thing, and I know which one the bank wants to hear about less. Walter didn't say anything back. He just looked out at 90 acres that had fed his family for 100 years and were now, quietly, starting to fail them. 3 weeks before that October morning, Sadie had gone looking for something to hold on to. She let herself into her grandmother's empty house. Nobody had touched it since the funeral, and in the drawer of the sewing table she found it. A spiral notebook, soft at the edges, filled with Ruth's careful handwriting. Recipes on some pages. On others, notes that didn't make sense to an 8-year-old at first glance. Browns and greens. Turn every 12 days. Compost is a promise you keep to dirt you can't see yet. Sadie didn't fully understand it, but she understood that her grandmother had written it down because she wanted someone to have it. So she carried the notebook out behind the barn to where Ruth's old bin sat abandoned and half collapsed, and she started reading it like instructions left for exactly this moment. She biked through the hollow that week and saw what she'd never noticed before. Every farm had one. A slumped, forgotten, given up on compost pile at the edge of a field, left too wet or too dry, nobody willing to put more work into something everybody had already decided was ruined. She started asking to take it. Neighbors mostly laughed and told her to help herself to garbage nobody wanted anyway. She spent her afternoons at the county library after that, and 2 more at Dana Reyes's office, borrowing books on soil biology far above an 8-year-old reading level, working through them anyway with her grandmother's notebook open beside her like a second, gentler teacher. She read about carbon-to-nitrogen ratios, about the thermophilic bacteria that heat a compost pile past 130 degrees and cook the pathogens out of it, about mycelium, the underground fungal threads that reach farther than roots ever could and hand a plant phosphorus in exchange for sugar. Then she went out with the wheelbarrow. Her first attempt failed, and it failed in a way that made her sit down in the dirt and cry harder than she had since the funeral. She'd spread the collected material straight onto a small bed behind the kitchen garden and planted spinach in it, the way she imagined her grandmother might have. Within 4 days the seedlings yellowed, curled, and died. The compost had still been raw, half-finished, still hot with decomposition, and it had burned the young roots the way straight fertilizer would. She went back to the notebook, back to Dana Reyes, who this time sat with her for an hour after work witut being asked twice. Immature compost competes with a plant for nitrogen, Dana told her gently. It isn't ready until it's finished being something else first. So Sadie rebuilt it. She layered the collected kitchen waste with dry leaves raked from the ditches along Miller's Gap Road, added a shovelful of old finished compost from her grandmother's original bin to seed it with living biology, and watered it until it held together like a wrung-out sponge. She pushed an old meat thermometer from her grandmother's kitchen drawer into the center of the pile every morning before school, the way she imagined Ruth checking on something she loved. Day 3, 128 degrees. She turned it, the way the notebook said to, arms shaking, breath ragged with cold. Day 6, 141 degrees. She started crying again that morning, but it was a different kind of crying. She had never told her father this, but some part of her had believed that if she did this right, the way her grandmother would have, it would feel like Ruth was still somehow there. And for the first time since the funeral, checking that thermometer in the freezing dark, it did. Word moved through Ivy Hollow the way it always does. Not cruelly, most of it, but with the particular amusement people reserve for things that look foolish and harmless at once. A little girl in her dead grandmother's coat, out in the cold with a pitchfork, hauling everyone's rejected compost. Denny Hargrove asked Walter, half laughing, what exactly his daughter thought she was doing out there in November. Walter told him the truth. He didn't fully know yet, either. But every night that winter, he found himself standing at the kitchen window a little longer, watching his daughter tend something in the dark the way his own mother used to. Colleen never laughed. She brought Sadie hot cocoa at the fence line some evenings and didn't ask questions, just stood beside her while she checked the pile, because she recognized what her daughter was actually doing out there, even if nobody else did. By February, The windrow behind the barn had transformed completely. What had been sour and gray and half-rotten was now dark, crumbly, and smelled like a forest floor after rain. Sadie dug into the base one afternoon and found it laced with white fungal threads and threaded through with earthworms, more life than she'd ever seen in one shovelful of dirt. She worked the finished compost into her test bed in late February, 3 inches deep, and waited out the last frost the way you wait for something you're afraid to hope for. In April, she planted tomatoes, beans, and 2 short rows of corn, the same seed her father used in the main field. By June, anyone walking past could see the difference from the road. Sadie's plants were a green so deep it looked almost blue, and when she carefully dug beside one tomato plant to check the roots, the way the notebook had taught her, what she found was a dense white web reaching in every direction, further than she'd imagined roots could go. Dana Reyes came out in July and knelt beside the bed for a long time without saying anything. When she finally looked up at Walter, her voice wasn't a teacher's voice anymore. "The soil structure did this," she said. "Better aggregation, better water retention, nutrients released slow enough for the roots to actually use them." She paused, looking at Sadie. The roots went looking, and they found something worth finding. By late July, the results weren't subtle. The tomatoes came in heavy enough to need staking twice over. The beans hung thick on the vine. The 2 rows of corn, identical seed to her father's 90 acres, measured nearly 28% higher in both weight and kernel count than the rest of the farm. Dana's clipboard confirmed it twice. Denny Hargrove walked across the fence line to see it for himself and stood at the edge of that small plot for a long time, hands in his pockets, saying nothing. "What did she actually do?" he finally asked. Walter was quiet a moment, watching his daughter kneel in the dirt she'd carried there herself, wearing his mother's boots. "She fed the soil," he said. "Not the plant. The soil. She learned it from somebody who isn't here to see it, and she did it anyway." By August, 3 other farms had asked Sadie to walk their fields. She carried her grandmother's notebook everywhere now, filled in around the edges with her own handwriting. And when she spoke about carbon ratios and living soil, she did it with the plain fluency of someone who had learned it the hard way, through failure, through grief, through cold mornings nobody made her get up for. Dana asked her to speak at the fall extension meeting. Walter sat in the front row that night and said almost nothing on the drive home, but Colleen, watching him in the rearview mirror, saw him wipe his eyes twice. Denny Hargrove stopped Walter at the mailbox a few days later. "I thought she was hauling garbage," he admitted. "She was," Walter said. "She just knew it wasn't garbage anymore. Neither of us did, not until she showed us." The real harvest that year was never the corn or the tomatoes. It was a 9-year-old girl who turned a grandmother's absence into something she could still tend with her own 2 hands. Proof, patient and quietly earned, that what gets thrown away is rarely worthless, that grief and neglect can both be turned the same way compost is turned, until something alive comes up out of what everyone else had given up on. What part of Sadie's story stayed with you? Tell us in the comments, and let us know where in the world you're watching from tonight. If stories like this one find you when you need them, stay close. We've got more waiting.